Hey guys, today we're going to install the Havoc 5-inch lift kit on the Chevy Silverado 2500 HD. Now this truck, I'm sure you already know, has torsion bars, so if you don't already have a torsion bar tool, make sure you run down to the local parts store and go ahead and get one, because they are going to have to be removed for the installation of this kit. Now there's also going to be some cutting and drilling, so make sure you read through the instructions, get all the tools you need, and you're just comfortable with it. Now let's go ahead and get started.
First, we're going to use the GM Torsion Bar tension tool to relieve tension on the torsion key. Now you'll notice once we relieve the tension, the actual tensioner block will become loose in the frame. The first thing that you're going to want to do is measure the threads that are showing on the key blocks for the torsion bar, and then you're going to want to mark the driver and passenger side to differentiate those when you put them back together. After you back the bolt out, the plate just slides out. Now we'll just remove the tensioner tool and continue with the installation. Next, we're going to want to mark the passenger and driver side torsion bars and indicate front and rear. Now we're just going to slide the torsion bar forward so that we can remove the torsion key. All right, now we're going to use a 21 millimeter to loosen the torsion bar crossmember bracket. All right, now we're going to use a 13 millimeter extension and socket to remove the bracket that's holding this piece here so that we can get this bolt out of its carrier piece so that we can drop this other crossmember down. All right, now that we've got this bracket loose so that we can pull this bolt out, we're just going to remove the bolt and then drop this crossmember. Now we're going to remove the torsion bar by sliding it towards the rear of the vehicle and freeing it from the lower control arm. And we'll just repeat that on the other side. All right, now we're going to remove these 4 15 millimeter bolts and drop the belly pan down out of the way. Now we're going to use a 15 millimeter top and bottom to go ahead and loosen and remove the bolt that's holding the sway bar end links together. We're going to do that on the driver and the passenger side. Now before we take anything else loose, I suggest using a breaker bar and a 21 millimeter and go ahead and just break loose the brake caliper bolts that attach it to the hub. It's got some yellow thread lock on these here that holds these things in super tight. All right, next we're going to use a 21 millimeter to remove the nut that holds the tie rod end link in place. Now we don't want to take the nut all the way off. We'll thread it back on a few threads, and then we're going to use a hammer to tap the side of the knuckle, being careful not to hit the boot. As you can see, it just pops loose. Then you remove the nut, and that drops out of the way. Next, we're going to remove the ABS line from all of its holders and release the connector. Red tab slides forward, and then you take a small screwdriver, stick it in here, and separate it. Should just pull right apart. Now we use a 14 millimeter to loosen up the bolt and remove it that holds the brake line bracket in place to the body. Now we use a 10 millimeter to remove the brake line bracket bolt from the knuckle. Now we're going to use a 21 millimeter to go ahead and remove the bolts we loosened earlier that hold the caliper to the wheel hub, making sure not to let it drop, and you don't want to put any stress on this brake line, and then hang the brake line out of the way, making sure again not to have any tension on this brake line when you do so. We're just using a bungee wrapping around a section of the caliper here. and we're going to hang it on the upper control arm for right now.
All right, so now we're going to remove the hub dust cover. What you want to do is just use a chisel and a hammer or a small screwdriver, and you kind of just want to work your way along the edge here. And you don't want to beat on it too hard because you don't want to mar up this cover or the retaining wall on the inside. So what we're going to do is just we're going to lightly tap around the edge, just kind of try to create some separation all the way around. And then we'll take a screwdriver and just kind of try to pry it off. All right, so next we want to remove the brake rotor. To do that, we need to first take out this T30 bolt right here. And then it just comes right off.
Now we're going to use a 34mm axle socket to remove the axle nut. We're also going to remove the washer and save that for use later. Now we're going to use a 21mm to remove the 4 bolts that hold the carrier bearing assembly to the knuckle. Now we're going to just pull the carrier bearing away from the knuckle, making sure to push on the CV axle so that it separates in one piece. Now we're going to use an 18mm wrench to loosen the nut and leave a few threads that holds the knuckle to the upper control arm. Now we're going to use a hammer and tap the side of the knuckle where it attaches to the upper control arm, being careful not to strike any part of the actual ball joint here. Now you notice we left a nut on there so that it could catch it and it doesn't come flying off. Now we're going to use a 24mm socket to remove the nut on the bottom that holds the knuckle to the lower control arm and then thread it back on just a few threads. Now we'll go ahead and take the 18mm nut that holds the knuckle to the upper control arm completely off. Now we're going to use a hammer and tap the side of the knuckle where it attaches to the lower control arm until it drops down and rests against the nut. Now we'll just take the nut the rest of the way off, and the knuckle will be free from both the upper and lower control arms. We can just slide it off. Now we're going to use a 15mm to remove all of the CV axle retaining bolts where it connects to the front differential. When we take the last one out, we need to be careful because the CV axle can potentially drop to the floor. I'm going to keep a hand on it. I found that if you kind of slide it out backwards, it helps because you don't have to fight this flange trying to pull it out the front. All right, now we're going to use a 21mm socket and wrench and remove the lower shock mount bolt. Okay, we're going to use a 21mm wrench to remove the 2 nuts that hold the top of the shock to the body of the vehicle. I'll go ahead and drop the shock out and remove it. Now we're going to use a 21mm socket and a 24mm wrench to remove the lower control arm retaining bolts, and we're going to remove the lower control arm and set it aside for further use. Now we're going to use a rubber mallet or some channel locks to remove the bump stops and set those aside for use later. Now we're going to take a permanent marker or a crayon or something and mark where the front drive shaft attaches to the front differential, showing orientation all the way across the U-joint here. Now we're going to use an 11mm to remove the retaining nuts that hold the U-joint together. just go ahead and separate the front drive shaft from the front differential.
And hang it out of the way.
Now we'll use an 18mm socket and wrench to remove the 4 bolts that hold this cross member in place. All right, now there's a breather tube up on top of this front diff that I'm just gonna pull off with my hand. It's virtually impossible to see up there. I can't even see what I'm doing, just doing it by feel. All right, it's loose now. We're good to go. We're gonna disconnect this wire right here, slide the red tab back, stick a small screwdriver in the opening and pull back the actual retaining clip piece. Gently pull back and it should break free. And then there's 3 clips that we're gonna wanna remove from the actual front diff. One here, kind of hard to see. And we'll just pull those loose. All right, got 2 loose, and then there's one on the back side here that just needs to be loosened up. And then we'll move on to the next step. All right, now we're gonna loosen but not remove 4 of the mounting bolts that hold the front differential in place. There's a rear mounting bolt that is up here. It's virtually impossible to see. I'm actually doing it blind. That is actually going to be removed with an 18mm and taken out. The other 4 are just going to be loosened at this time. I'll move my head in a second. I really can't see anything when I do that. Oh, come on, baby. Okay, I think it's loose enough to go by hand now. If you reach your hand in the back here and then go in through the rear, you should be able to get your fingertips on it and gently coax it out of the hole. I'd recommend getting this bolt out first, as you don't want to create any tension on this when you come out. This would not allow you to be able to use your hands to remove the last bit of these threads, and it is hard to get to. All right, now that we've got that back mounting bolt out, we're actually just going to remove the bolts that hold the front diff in place. We've got our transmission jack here to hold it, and we've got about 3 guys to help us hoist this thing down and maneuver it out of the actual cavity in the bottom of the truck. But we recommend loosening these bolts and then letting it get loose, and then kind of taking your time and being very careful. Safety is very important here. Now this thing is loose and it's just kind of working its way out of this cavity. Take your time, be careful, and use as many hands as you have necessary or available to get this thing dropped down and out of the way.
Are you guys ready to go down?
Yep. Okay, Kirsten is free from the retaining bolts.
Okay. Let me know if you need to stop it.
I think it's fine. We're just going to kind of twist it this way. Okay, stand by. It's starting to catch on here a little bit. There we go. You're
Okay,
fine.
got it?
Yep.
Okay, going down.
You can come down a little bit quicker now. Okay, let's just kind of
All right, you're kind of on the edge there. Yep.
cover that on here. Now we're going to be cutting a section of the lower control arm mount on the driver's side where it mounts in the rear of the vehicle. So what we're going to have to do in order to cut this section here, we need to measure first. So we go from the center where the lower control arm mounts 2.5 inches out, and we're going to make a vertical line to mark where we're going to cut. Okay, now on the front portion of that same ear that mounts the lower control arm, we're going to make a line 1.25 inches from the center of the hole, and we're going to do that in a vertical manner, and then we're going to go on the top of the frame up here, and we're going to connect this line diagonally out to that 2.5 inch mark on the other side, and we're going to cut along that line and remove this entire piece here so that we can have room for our install. All right, now that we've cut this piece off here, we're gonna go ahead and grind this down with a flapper wheel, clean it up, and then we're gonna paint this surface to make sure that we don't have any kind of residual rust issues. All right, now we're going to add some spray paint to the raw steel surface where we just removed material. Now we're going to be installing the bump stop extension brackets. We're going to be using some nut certs, so we'll need to drill out this hole here, and this hole here. We're going to be going to a 17/32 for this hole, and we'll be using an 11/16 on this hole. It's a good idea to test fit each one of your nut certs before you change bits out to ensure that you don't need to trim the hole just a tiny bit. I'm just going to take nut cert and just test fit, make sure that slides in there. That hole's good to go. Test fit this hole here. Everything looks good. Now we'll change bit sizes. Now we're going to use an 11/16 bit to make this hole a little bit larger here. All right, and we'll test fit that larger size nut cert real quick to make sure it works. Everything fits nicely. All right, now we're going to use the nut cert tool. It's to just slip this over the larger bolt. Make sure this piece goes here. And you're going to put your nut cert on. Spin it all the way down to the bottom. You're going to put your nut cert into the hole that we just drilled out. Then you're going to use a wrench on the outside. Helps have two people do this. There's a 7/8 inch wrench. Place that on this outside nut, the actual tool itself here, and then we're going to use a 3/4 inch socket, and we're going to press up on the actual nut cert to make sure that's sitting flush inside of that actual bump stop receiver, and then you're going to be very carefully tightening. This goes to 90 foot-pounds of torque, so be careful. This will just get you kind of started. Once you feel it start locking in there, make sure that you're nice and flush. Press on a little bit, put your wrench in there. Once you feel like nothing's moving around, you get your torque wrench and set that to 90 foot-pounds. This portion here works better to have an extra set of hands. So again, use your 7/8 wrench on the actual tool piece here. And then we're just going to set our torque to 90 pound-feet. There it went. Get that out, being careful. Make sure that that nut cert isn't spinning. And just back your tool bolt and jam nut out. And there you go. We'll go ahead and move to the smaller size. All right, now same thing as the large nut cert. We're just going to put the tool on that, mount it. I've already got that done. We're going to take the gold nut cert and put it in the rear here. The silver one goes up front in this hole, which it's a little bit shorter, you can see. I'm going to use hand tools on this because I can actually access it. So I'm using a 9/16 inch socket and a 17mm to hold that jam nut in place while I tighten it. And you want to keep kind of up pressure on the wrench while you tighten. Make sure it sits nice and flush. You can put about 45 foot-pounds of torque on this one. All right, when you pull this thing out, just be real careful, spin it, make sure your nut cert is not spinning. And we'll move on to the next bolt. Now we're going to take the shorter of the two nut certs and put it up on the front pump stock extension bracket, in this top location right here. Go. Now just remove that and we'll move to the installation of the drop brackets. Now we're going to actually put the brackets in place. On the back one here we've got a little plate that slides into the old bump stop. And that just kind of locks in there. We're going to thread a bolt in there on this other side. I use blue thread locker on all of my threads just to make sure that this stuff doesn't vibrate out. Personal choice, you don't have to do it. I would highly recommend it though. And this one here, you're going to use the 9/16 head bolt that's a little bit shorter. For the nut cert pieces, we're going to use the longer bolts. And we'll grab the longer, one of the longer 9/16 bolts. Again, using thread locker. Just the medium strength blue stuff seems to do the job just fine. We're going to be using a 9/16 wrench. It's about the only way you can get in there. I recommend going to about 30 pound-feet of torque here, or foot-pounds, whatever you want to call it. Same deal here. Except this has the nut cert in it. We're using the larger bolt here. A 1/2 inch 18 threaded bolt. The lock nut and a a washer. Get that started. And then another one of the longer 9/16 bolts. And we'll just torque those down. I always use hand tools on anything that I'm tightening into a nut cert just to be safe. Now we're going to put the factory bump stops into the extension brackets. It helps, I've noticed if you put a little bit of grease around the edge to help them slide in. Same thing with the front one. A little bit of good housekeeping, use a rag to go ahead and wipe up any residue around that so you don't get it all over you. Now we'll jump over to the other side and repeat those same steps, then move on to the drop bracket for the front differential.
All right, so the next step is we're going to take these bushings and insert it into our differential bracket here. Now, so you want to try it by hand first. We got the press here in case we want to use that, but we always want to try to use it by hand so that we don't crush these bushings. And I also got the mallet in case I need some help. So that one went on, not too bad. This other side might be a little bit of a different story. Sometimes you just got to work it in just like that. Push it in. Then you got your metal sleeve. So you just want to use a rubber mallet and just kind of beat it till it's flush. Like so. Okay, so now we got our differential on the table here. We're going to remove these 4 bolts right here. And that's where our differential bracket is going to get mounted to. You don't need to keep these factory bolts. They've provided in the kit 4 new bolts for that. And we're going to use some red Loctite on those just to make sure that none of this vibrates loose. So your differential bracket is going to mount just like that, with the bushing actually facing out away from the differential. So again, on your differential, you want to make sure these new bolts that you have a washer on there, and you use that red Loctite to make sure that none of these bolts come loose. And when you get them all in, you want to tighten these down to 40 foot-pounds. All right, so we'll go ahead and use a 17 millimeter, just snug these up, and then we'll get our torque wrench out and actually torque them down. All right, so we got our torque wrench out with that 17 millimeter, and we're gonna tighten those down to 40 foot-pounds. If Jimmy can hold it down. So when you hear that click, that means you're good to go. Move on to the next one. So we're on the passenger side of the vehicle, and we got the single gusseted differential bracket here. That's how you can distinguish the passenger side from the driver's side. The passenger side is going to be a single gusset, and you're just going to put it right up into the factory bolt holes right there. And then you're going to use your factory nuts that you removed off the differential, and just thread those right on there. And again, we're using the blue thread lock. So we got our torque wrench, and now we're going to tighten these nuts onto 65 foot-pounds.
All right, now we're going to grab the double gusseted driver's side drop bracket for the front differential, and we're going to use the provided bolts with a 1/2-inch washer to go into the factory holes here. Again, I'm using thread lock just to ensure this thing doesn't come apart down the road. All right, now we're going to torque these down to 65 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and mount the front differential on the drop brackets using the provided hardware. Make sure you're very careful with this. Again, it's super heavy. Safety first. We're using a transmission jack here and got as many sets of hands as we have available. Good. All right, now at this time we're going to leave the bolts loose, but I'd like to get a couple of threads onto the actual locking nuts so that there's no way these things could back out while we're working under here. Now we're going to put the rear crossmember drop bracket for the lower control arm in. I'm going to slide that middle bracket over the front diff mount and then feed the bolts in from the back forward. We'll just thread the nuts onto the back, again using blue thread lock on all of these threads. Okay, we found that in order to get this bolt threaded through this bracket here, we had to disconnect one of the sides, so we disconnected the driver's or the passenger side. Now we can line this bolt up, get it put in, put the nut and washer on. Go ahead and pull down on that some more. Now that we've got it in, we can then put the bolt back in to mount the other side of the cross member there, and then we'll get everything tightened up. All right, now we're going to go ahead and tighten all of the mount bolts for the front differential to 65 foot-pounds. So we'll go ahead and tighten this bolt down here, and this is going to go to 95 foot-pounds of torque. All right, now we're going to just install the front drive shaft again, taking note of where all of our marks were. Grab our blue Loctite treated assembly here. These are an 11 millimeter, very common size. I'm just going to utilize an impact here and not even hit the bottom. Just these are fine threads to spin them in. Okay, we'll do it over here. There we go, got it seated nicely. 25 foot-pounds of torque to finish this thing off. Fit it tight. All right, now we're going to reconnect the electrical wire to the actuator on the front differential, and we're going to replace all of the grommets that go into the wire holder for that. And we're also going to reattach the breather tube. You're going to have to pull on that just a little bit to create enough slack. Now we're going to add the lower control arm drop bracket cross member. We're going to use the factory bolts. We're going to feed them from the front of the vehicle to the back. We're using the factory nuts.
And we're just going to leave them loose at this time.
All right, now we're going to put the lower control arm in place. We're going to use the short bolt up front, and we're going to feed from front to rear, so the nuts end up on the inside of these two brackets. And that's why we leave everything loose for these cross members. Just feed this in from back to front. That's the long bolt. All right, go ahead and put a washer and then the lock nut on. Again, I use blue thread lock. After we get done with this, we're going to leave the hardware loose at this time, and then we're going to repeat this over on the other side. And now we're going to put the aftermarket skid plate in place using the provided hardware. All right, so the next thing we did is went ahead and tightened all four of our bolts that attach the drop brackets to 250 pound-feet of torque. And now we're just going to go ahead and grab the new replacement knuckle using the factory hardware and attach that to the lower control arm first and then to the upper control arm. All right, we're gonna go ahead and tighten this one to 74 foot-pounds of torque.
37.
And this one's gonna tighten to 37 foot-pounds of torque. We're using an Allen wrench here in the shaft of this, a 24 millimeter to tighten that up. This ball joint will spin until it gets a little bit of tension on it. On this one again, we're using an Allen wrench, 19 millimeter, so that ball joint doesn't spin while we're trying to snug it up. Once you get it snug, we can put the torque wrench on it. We're going to remove this rubber O-ring from the factory knuckle. It's in here in the factory knuckle, and just put that here in the aftermarket one. All right, now we're going to trim the dust shield for the brake caliper. As you can see, I've got a line marked here to kind of continue along this same line here, straight out to the edge. It's the bottom edge, not next to the brake ABS line. And what I've done is I've just left it on the actual hub assembly so that it kind of holds it in place so I can cut it. It's about the only thing I could find that could hold it nicely while I do this trimming. Next, we're going to put the unit bearing back into place. ABS line faces up. Just going to put that in correct orientation. And we're just going to use the factory bolts, thread those back in. All right, we're going to go ahead and tighten these unit bearing bolts from the back side. We're going to go to 125 pound-feet of torque. All right, now we're going to reinstall the CV axle. Thread the flange in first, back into the cavity up on top of the skid plate, and then maneuver it around to where you can put the shank inside of the unit bearing. What I'm going to do is put the washer and the nut on just to hold it in place while we maneuver this around on the back side. Spin this, get the flange up into place, and replace all 8 of these bolts. Once again, making sure to thread lock all these bolts. This is really good practice to make sure nothing vibrates out. Now we're going to attach the CV axle and torque these down to 40 pound-feet of torque. I'm using a breaker bar here to hold this hub in place so it doesn't spin while he puts torque on it. So now we're going to set the hub nut to 155 pound-feet of torque. We're using a couple of lug nuts here with a breaker bar so that we can be able to tighten this without spinning the hub. We're just going to replace our dust cap, put it into place, and just give it a little tap-a-roo with the hammer. Now we're going to reinstall the brake rotor, making sure to line up where the screw goes here. And we use a T30. Go ahead and torque that down. All right, now we're going to replace the factory brake line. with an aftermarket steel braided one. First thing we're going to do is use a 13mm line wrench, and we're going to remove this actual joint here where the rubber and the metal meet. Takes a little bit of time as we go. We're going to want to use some paper towels just to keep everything clean, and then in addition to that, make sure you put a pan below your work surface so you don't drip brake fluid all over the floor. This does tend to get a little bit messy. Now we'll just go ahead and remove this the rest of the way. And we're going to use some pliers. We're going to pull out this clip here. And then those are going to separate. I'm actually going to hold the end of this brake line with my finger. Then we're going to mount the caliper back into its original factory location using the factory bolts, making sure to thread lock those bolts. Once we've got the bolts in place, we're going to tighten them to 125 pound-feet of torque. All right, now we're going to remove the 11mm banjo bolt from the back of the caliper. There's a copper crush washer on either side of the factory brake line. We're going to want to remove the banjo bolt, discard those copper crush washers, and install one on each side of the replacement brake line. You're going to want to put the flat side facing towards the actual caliper, and the piece with the ridge is facing away. Now we're going to tighten this down to 25 foot-pounds of torque to crush those copper crush washers. So now we're going to attach the new brake line to the old hard brake line. So we're just going to run it through that mount here. And let's move our drip pan back underneath it. We'll just hand tighten that to start. We're going to use an 18 and then our 13mm. You got to make sure that this thing doesn't spin. When you do it, you really have to be careful to hold this brake line in place. You don't want to cause any damage. You're going to get a little bit of brake fluid loss when you're doing this. There's really no way around it. But we'll bleed the brakes whenever we're done to take care of that. All right, once we've got that snug but not super tight, we're going to put our replacement pin in here using a hammer. You can reuse the old one, they say, but I'd rather just use the new one. Once you've got that locked into place, you want to go back and give it a good tighten. Make sure that this line has got a nice smooth arc running up here. You want to get a good, this is a compression fitting, so you want to make sure this is nice and tight. That pin helps to hold everything into place. All right, now we're just going to put some straps on the brake line and ABS line. You'll notice on the back of the knuckle here, we have a couple of threaded holes, one low, one high. The lower hole is going to get the braided brake line attached to it using the provided hardware. Use an 11mm to go ahead and snug those guys up. All right, now we're going to plug the ABS line back in. Make sure to tuck that red tab back forward, back towards you. It's locked in. And then we're just going to slide this back onto the clip. Now we're going to add a strap onto the front of the knuckle, holding the ABS line in place. should have a nice bit of slack on each end so that the line can vibrate and move around a little without creating tension on any single part of it. All right, now it's a good time to take the knuckle and rotate it through its entire working portion to make sure your line moves freely. Make sure nothing gets snagged or hangs up. Everything looks good, and we'll just move on with the install. All right, now we're gonna add the sway bar end link into place. There's an aftermarket part. We're gonna have the washer and then a rubber on each end. We're gonna add a rubber and then another washer on top, and then the same on bottom. We're going to use a 9/16" wrench and a 5/8 socket in order to tighten this down. You're just going to want to tighten it enough until the rubber starts to squish just a little bit, and that'll be tight enough. All right, now we're going to put the tie rod end link back in place. This feeds from the top. Just rotate your knuckle around, slide that in, and use the factory nut on the bottom here. Now spin that on by hand. Then you're going to use a 10mm wrench and a 21mm wrench to tighten this thing up, and then we'll set the torque specs once we have this snug. Once it's snug, you won't have to use the wrench on the bottom, and we can put a torque wrench on it. Right now we're going to set this to 37 foot-pounds of torque. Now we're adding in the shock. This is the aftermarket shock, and we're going to use the factory hardware to reattach that. There it goes.
Right there.
Bottom bolt's in place, and then we're going to replace the factory nut. We added some blue thread lock as a precaution, even though these are lock nuts. Get that threaded in place, and then add the two nuts on the top. Then we'll tighten everything down and go over the torque specs. We're going to tighten the top nuts down to 50 foot-pounds each. All right, this bottom bolt here, we're going to tighten to 90 foot-pounds. All right, we've got the Torsion Bar Crossbeam piece here. You'll see there's two holes on either end. They're kind of small. We're going to open those up to 5/16 inch with a drill bit. We'll do that on both sides of the beam. Now we're going to take these brackets and put these in the ends of the Torsion Bar Crossmember. There's the hole we drilled out. You're going to take the provided hardware, washer, and then drop it through, and then a washer and a nut on the bottom side. So locking nut. We still added thread lock again. Now we're going to add the factory bolt back in. There's a welded nut on the back side, so we're going to thread it through the front. And then we'll go ahead and torque all this stuff down. Do that on both ends of the crossmember. All right, we're going to set these large bolts to 90 and the top bolts to 20. We're setting this to 20 pound-feet of torque. All right, now we're going to insert the torsion bars into the torsion keys in the lower control arms. Run those about 6 inches through and let those hang. We're going to go from front to rear with the bolt.
Right there.
There it is.
Got it. Now we just add the nuts and torque it down to spec. Now we'll go ahead and torque these bad boys down to 90 foot-pounds. Oh! Okay. All right, now we're going to put our torsion bars back in place along with our torsion keys. Make sure you follow all your marks, passenger, driver's side. Torsion bar and key should just go in one way. We're going to preload the spring and then add the tensioner back in. All right, now we're going to go ahead and preload the spring by pressing the key into place with the tool. Now that we've got that preloaded, we'll add the tensioner block back into place and then put the bolt in. Now here's where you need to make sure you reference the measurements that you took in the very beginning step when we took the torsion bars off. You should be able to see kind of on the threads here where there's no grease, get a rough idea of where you're at, and then use your tape on both sides to get that tension set correctly. All right, now we'll release our tensioner and we should be good to go. Now we're going to remove the bracket that hangs the parking brake from the frame with a 13mm.
All right, so now we're going to remove this plastic clip that's holding on our ABS wire from both the passenger and the driver's side.
All right, we're going to actually discard this clip here by removing it off of the ABS line. We won't be reusing that. And then we'll do the same thing on the other side. First, we're going to support the center of the rear axle to ensure that it doesn't move around. Then we're going to remove both shocks by first removing the lower bolt and then the upper bolt. You just take your 21mm wrench, give it a couple of hits with this. We'll remove this. All right, now we're going to use an adjustable crescent wrench here, and we're just going to slide that over the top of this brake line bracket on the top of the rear end. And we need to bend this bracket so that it faces up. Now, it has some hard lines attached to it, so we got to be careful as we bend to make sure that those are bending and not kinking. And that seemed like it created a nice amount of slack there. I think that should be good. If it needs more adjustment, we'll just bend it a little bit more. All right, now we're going to remove the factory U-bolts from the passenger side, and then we're going to loosen the driver's side only, but still leave those on. And again, please make sure that you have the rear end securely fastened to a transmission jack or something of the sort so that it doesn't drop down on you, ruin a bunch of brake lines and all kinds of fun stuff if that happens. All right, we're just loosening the driver's side now. All right, now we're going to add in the lift block. There's a screw that you need to place in the bottom of the threaded hole. It's a cap head screw, and that's going to be your locator pin for the axle side, and then there's a hole that is going to be the locator pin for your actual leaf spring. So we're going to lower down the jack that supports the center here very carefully, and that should allow the passenger side to go ahead and drop down slowly as we relieve pressure on that. We'll be very careful looking at all of our brake lines, making sure nothing's snagging. We'll just make enough clearance for that block to fit. Looks like we can slide it in here almost. All of our clearances are still looking good. Okay, once you get it in, drop that pin into the hole, and then we're going to use the jack to lift it back up into place, guiding that pin in the leaf spring into the hole inside of the lift block. All right, now we're just going to pump up the axle until that alignment pin goes in place. You'll have to kind of pull on the axle, twist the block just a little bit, go up nice and slow, make sure you're not pinching any hands, brake lines, wires, anything into that cavity. All right, looks like we got a good mating of all the holes. Now we're just going to add the U-bolts back into place, grabbing the aftermarket U-bolts. All right, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sand off or grind off about a 1/4 inch of clearance here. We're on the passenger side. This is where the shock mounts, and it's going to come in contact with this potentially if we don't grind this off. So we're going to put the rear shock in. You're going to want to put the bushings top and bottom, and then put the bushing sleeve in after that. You may have to use a rubber mallet or something to that effect. We mount the top first. Each one of these bolts is going to be torqued down to 100 foot-pounds. All right, now we'll torque these down. Click.
Click.
All right, now we're going to take the passenger side parking brake cable and put it back into the hanger. We're going to leave the driver's side loose. And then we're just going to put that back in and tighten it back down. All right, next we're going to take off these copper pieces here off of the studs. There's 2 on each rear wheel. You just take a little small screwdriver. You can break that real easily and it'll just come right off. All right, with the truck on the ground, we're going to go ahead and torque all the U-bolts to 125 foot-pounds. Now with the vehicle on the ground, we drove it back and forth a couple of times, hitting the brakes. That's double checking our brake bleeding job that we did after replacing the line, as well as bouncing the front suspension to get it to settle a little bit so that we can torque these bolts down that hold the lower control arm on. Now we're supposed to go to 250 foot-pounds of torque on all 4 of the bolts. That's 2 on each side, front and rear, of the lower control arms. All right, so we've got the lift kit on, the wheels and tires are on. We've had it aligned, everything checks out, it works great. Unfortunately, we've got some clearance issues here. They're pretty severe. We checked on the other side and did some trimming, cutting, so we've got it figured out exactly where we need to remove some material, both from the bumper and from the air dam on the bottom here. This should be really close to getting us what we need for our wheel and tire combo. So what we're going to do is use an angle grinder to cut this metal here. You definitely want to use some tape, measure 3 or 4 times, and what we did is started with a small amount and just worked our way out so that we didn't take off any more than we needed to, and just take your time on this actual painted bumper here. All right, now before we button everything back up, take the tape off and clean everything, we're going to make sure that our clearance issues have been mitigated, so we'll just go ahead and run the wheel through its rotation cycle. Looks like we're going to have to trim a little bit more of the inner wheel well material, but everything else looks to be pretty good. All right, now we're going to use a razor knife to trim a little bit of the wheel well material out of the way because we're having some interference issues with that as well. Once you're done with the cut, you're going to want to take a flapper wheel to the back side, take some 300 grit and clean up the edges, and use some scratch paint from any auto parts store to give it a nice appearance.
All right guys, now that completes the installation. Now remember, after about 500 miles, you're going to want to go back underneath and check all your bolts, make sure they're still torqued down to spec. Now if you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online. Thanks.